24 mid-state men face some serious charges after they were caught trying to purchase sex from minors.
Of human trafficking in Ohio are on the rise.
At 6 tonight, officials in Toledo say the city is facing a human sex trafficking crisis.
New at 6, local victims of human trafficking break their silence about the man convicted of tormenting them.
Othello, it is the tragic reality of human trafficking and the result of what officials say is an apparent smuggling operation of undocumented immigrants that has cost so far at least 9 lives.
New at 6, with big events in the summer come big crowds, and where there are big crowds, trouble can brew.
Most people don't know that there are more people in slavery today than at any other time in human history, about 45 million.
Yeah, Carolyn, this young woman, only 18 years old, was essentially enslaved, forced to become a stripper while her tormentors took all of her money and abused and beat her.
Think about that. 3 days, 22 men, all of them willing to knowingly pay for sex with a minor.
The forced coercion of one person into a situation where they are being exploited for another person's gain. Sometimes that is labor, that might be having people basically work as slaves in your rock quarry and break rocks all day, and they don't get paid for it, or they don't get a living wage and they can't leave. It may be for sex, it may be for organs. There's an organ trafficking thing too. But it is exploiting other people and either selling them or enslaving them, where they don't, their rights are totally abused, and there is almost always some level of threat, coercion, force, or fraud involved.
I often have people draw a triangle, and at the top of the triangle put the word sex. At the bottom angle put a $sign, and on the other angle write coercion/child. If you have sex and coercion, what do you have? Rape. If you have sex and money, you have prostitution. All three have to be present to be human trafficking. If it's an adult, you have sex, something of value, it doesn't have to be money, and coercion. If it's a child, coercion doesn't need to be present. Any child, any minor used for commercial sex is a human trafficking victim.
Human trafficking and forced labor are forms of modern slavery that know no boundaries, spilling across international borders and impacting men, women, and children of all ages and all nationalities.
It's the same thing with labor trafficking. Some goods are being produced or services are being provided at no or very little pay on the part of the person involved.
Human trafficking is a pervasive human rights issue affecting millions, no matter their gender, age, or nationality.
We see people from every race, from every economic level, from every educational level. I have somebody who has a master's degree who was trafficked. So it really doesn't defer to any of those usual dividers. Of course, people who have less social clout are more vulnerable, because they don't have the resources to have parents or whoever go after the victim.
We just had some staff in Thailand earlier this year, and one of the organizations that we were connecting with there had just rescued an 18-month-old who had been ravaged in a red light area.
So basically, when you look at the vulnerabilities that are driving something like human trafficking, there are always considerations to take into account for race, ethnicity, religious beliefs, because in certain areas of the world, certain populations are more they're more susceptible to things like poverty and prejudice, and different issues that ultimately drive other issues coming out of it. So poverty, for example, there's certain classes or ethnic groups that might be more susceptible to poverty, and poverty is a huge driver for something like trafficking. It's also a driver for something like gang affiliation. Gang affiliation and trafficking are the same. They look exactly the same. And the way that kids are recruited into gangs is the same as how kids are recruited into trafficking. In fact, I know that when I interview a child and they report gang affiliation, I understand that there is an increased likelihood that they have been exploited sexually as females through that process.
Anytime you have extreme poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunities, and governments that with histories of corruption and abuse, it's, all of those things are contributing factors to human trafficking. What we see in Cambodia, where we're working, if you're familiar with the history of that country, there was a massive genocide that started in the mid-70s with the Khmer Rouge and General Pol Pot, and they targeted everybody who was educated, anybody who was professors or professionals. They targeted people with glasses because they considered them to be more intellectual, and they just murdered, wiped out about a third of the population of the country. And so, as you can imagine, it just decimated so many levels of what was of the culture and of the economy and everything. They also tore down infrastructure. Anything that they thought could be a threat to their power, they went after and destroyed. And so when that regime fell, the country's left in shambles. They've lost their brightest leaders and those who had the opportunity to get a good education and move forward professionally, and you're left with poor infrastructure, you're left with trauma, a traumatized generation that's experienced war and starvation and the loss of family members and horrific cruelty. And then, you're trying to rebuild after that, and there's poor education, there's no job opportunities or limited job opportunities. All of that just kind of turns into a cocktail for something like human trafficking to become prevalent in a place like Cambodia.
So obviously the common thread that's driving something like trafficking is vulnerability, whatever that vulnerable factor is. So initially when I started working in the anti-trafficking field, all of our work was done internationally. And I remember in 2008, I took a trip to Chisinau, Moldova, which is this little tiny country that used to be part of the Soviet Union. And so when the wall fell and those people gained their independence, they really didn't know what to do with it. And it created vulnerability because you had people living in poverty, and then you had children that were virtually abandoned and orphans because their families were forced to work abroad. And I came back from that trip and I thought, okay, if the common theme of something, that's driving trafficking is vulnerability, and vulnerability in a place like Chisinau, Moldova, are orphans that are forced orphans because their family's poverty is driving that. What is it here in the United States? And so I really, in 2008, started to kind of dive into the issue of foster care. Kids that are in foster care and don't have adults looking out for them are at a higher risk. And then you have other things that are driving it, like abuse, neglect. I did a study with Vanderbilt, Peabody, Jill Robinson, probably 2009, where we looked at women that were being arrested for prostitution in Davidson County, and we surveyed them on, tell us a little bit about your history. And we found 100% of the women that were arrested for prostitution reported being sexually abused, which was a huge thing for us women. Anyone that has sexual abuse in their history, we know how that defines us. And so that was like an aha moment for me, where I really started to understand there are things happening before we get to that point. I'd heard for years, like, no little girls sitting down going, gosh, when I grow up, I think I'll be a prostitute. There are things actually that get women to that point.
A lot of people who are vulnerable to this kind of exploitation have already endured some kind of trauma. Most of the people that we work with have been abused as a child in some way, or they've experienced a trauma. One girl saw her mother kill her brother. Some sort of trauma like that makes them very vulnerable to look for a place of love and acceptance and to escape. If you have a runaway, you're very, very susceptible to trafficking, and you have to remember that child is running away from something. They're not running to something. So trauma, and then obviously once they are trafficked, they are enduring complex trauma. Think about the trauma of one rape and you have 10 times a day going on for years, you've got a serious amount of trauma going on, as well as the control mechanisms that are used. In the United States, about 76% of trafficking survivors were first approached by a trafficker online. We come across girls who met a cute 16-year-old boy online, saw a picture, he likes everything she likes, he sympathizes with her problems at home, and then he arranges to meet her, and he's not who he looked like online at all. He's a trafficker or he's a recruiter. Chat rooms, many social media are used by traffickers.
The thing about trafficking and any illegal matter is it happens in the dark corners. It happens underground.
They intersect with substance abuse in multiple ways. First of all, traffickers will go look for people who are abusing substances and know that they're not only vulnerable themselves, but very vulnerable are their children, because parents who are abusing substances will sometimes be desperate enough to sell their children in order to feed their own habit. We've seen traffickers who give drugs to their young victim and then will let them start going through withdrawal and then tell them what they have to do in order to get their next fix, and it's such a miserable experience that that child will do whatever it takes not to experience withdrawal anymore. We see some victims who are not using drugs or other substances who start doing so after they're trafficked. I think that's pretty understandable. It's just a way of coping with the very hellish existence that they're enduring.
Anywhere in the globe, human trafficking is like almost half the time, whether it's here in the States or internationally, there is a promise of a false job. There's a promise of, I'm going to help you, and that lures someone into an exploitative situation. I think that's the same around the world for the most part. There are always different situations where people are forced into something and there was no promise of anything. But in general, that's a big commonality. I think here in the States, we have a lot of things like that are much more hidden. I would say in a place like Cambodia, primarily where Freedom's Promise works, we have the poverty and stuff like that is just in your face. And there are streets that you can drive down and just see little shops with girls lined up on benches who are available for sex in the red light areas and the brothels. And so some of it's just way more in your face, and there's a desensitization to what it is. Whereas in other parts of the world, I think a desensitization to the evil, the level of poverty that people are living in outside of the U.S. is much greater, and there's more desperation, which also contributes more. A lot of times here in the States, these things are hidden behind other veneers a little better. So they're not quite smacking you between the eyeballs as much as they are in some parts of the world.
I started my work in this field internationally, so I got to explore this question firsthand. And certainly in some countries you have, for example, very isolated people groups, so they're very gullible to a trafficker who may sell them a story about how there's great opportunity for their child in the city. And in other countries, the corruption is so rampant that human trafficking is happening out in the open. In the United States, it tends to be more hidden. And then across the United States, you will find pockets of maybe more agricultural labor trafficking or more gang-related trafficking. You'll also notice the issue more in a community like ours where there's a robust response, a counter-trafficking work going on. But basically, trafficking across the country is very similar, and globally, it's all about some exploiter who sells a dream that turns into a nightmare. I think there are a lot of myths about human trafficking. One is just that this only happens in Cambodia. Obviously, it's happening in robust numbers here. The last study that was done, and it's an old one, says that between 94 and 110 minors are trafficked in Tennessee every month. And that's not counting those 18 and over, and those are old figures, so they're actually higher. A lot of people think that if there is trafficking in the United States, it's a foreign national and they're being brought over. But in actuality, 85% of all the cases that are identified in the United States are U.S. citizens. Only 15% are foreign nationals. Some people think that, I think they don't understand how young the victims are. That we're talking about 11, 12, 13-year-old boys, 12, 13, 14-year-old girls who are introduced. You don't have the life experience to understand the red flags that an older person might when somebody comes along and promises you a dream. I think that people feel distanced. Oh, this just happens in the bad neighborhoods in the big cities. But TBI, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, actually did a research study on the geography of trafficking and found it was just as common in small towns, in suburbs, in rural areas as it is in urban centers.
I've been collecting data for about a year now through the court system, asking every girl that comes into the court system as a runaway, do you know what sex trafficking is? And the large majority of them say yes. And so I say, tell me what you think it is. And then I actually write down the definition, or my staff writes down the definition. And so we have almost 300 girls that have given us a definition of trafficking. Now, Gabrielle Chapman, Dr. Chapman at Vanderbilt, will take those definitions and we'll start looking at keywords of what girls actually think trafficking is. And what we're seeing consistently is kidnapped. It's girls that are kidnapped. That's a recurrent thing. Most of the girls that we see don't understand that trafficking, whether it's through gangs or through the sex trade, trafficking initially looks like friendship or love. And that's really important for girls to understand, because if they don't understand what it is, how can they be empowered to fight it?
Efforts are being made that are really having some impact.
Human trafficking is not a business model, it is a crime, and we are going to stop it.
Thank you very much for being with us today as we signed this crucial legislation to combat online sex trafficking and bring criminals to justice.
When I first started talking about this issue a decade ago, every legislator said the same thing. That doesn't happen in my district. Nobody believes that anymore. So when I go to the Hill now and we lobby for bills, we have a strong base of support, both on the state level and on the national level.
In short, we're making clear that American tax dollars must never, ever be used to support the trafficking of human beings. We will have zero tolerance. We mean what we say. We will enforce it.
There's more awareness, there's more police cooperation and things like that when it comes to just being able to track people and put, press charges and things like that.
It's a very, very terrible problem. It's not talked about enough. People don't know enough about it. And we're going to talk about it, and we're going to bring it out into the open, and hopefully we're going to do a great deal to help prevent some of the horrific, really horrific crimes that are taking place.
Whether you are conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican, this is a no-brainer. This is something we should all agree on.
The reality is when any one of us is hurting, it's actually, I really believe it, in a way it's affecting all of us. And so we should care, because there's people living in really horrible situations that they don't need to be living in.
The consequences of our failure to act in this area has so many other negative impacts around the world. It breeds corruption, it undermines the rule of law, it erodes the core values that underpin a civil society. When state actors or non-state actors use human trafficking, it can become a threat to our national security.
Human trafficking is a blight on our community that has to be addressed. Human trafficking can touch any family. It crosses all economic, educational, and racial lines, happens in every zip code. And on top of that, it not only has a great financial cost to our communities, but it hinders us from creating communities that are safe for every Tennessee child.
It ought to concern every person, because it is a debasement of our common humanity. It ought to concern every community, because it tears at our social fabric. It ought to concern every business, because it distorts markets. It ought to concern every nation, because it endangers public health, and fuels violence and organized crime.
Human trafficking, forced labor, and modern slavery splinters families, distorts global markets, undermines the rule of law, strengthens transnational organized criminal networks, and threatens national security everywhere.
So I think the reason everyone should care about human trafficking is because it's a basic human rights issue. So it's basically looking at the basic right just for life being taken away from them and them feeling like they have no choice. And so that was the main reason that I got involved, is I thought, how can I know about something so tragic and turn turn a blind eye to it and not do anything about it? So I think just as human beings, we have to care about each other.
I'm here today to defend the right to pursue happiness. It's a simple notion, the right to pursue happiness. It's bestowed upon all of us by our Constitution. Every citizen of this country has the right to pursue it. And I believe that it is incumbent upon us as citizens of this nation, as Americans, to bestow that right upon others, upon each other, and upon the rest of the world. But the right to pursue happiness for so many is stripped away. It's raped. It's abused. It's taken by force, fraud, or coercion. It is sold for the momentary happiness of another.
Because when somebody is trafficked, their average lifespan is about 7 years.
Over 27 million people are enslaved today across the globe. That's more than 4 times the population of my home state of Tennessee. Modern slavery comes in many forms, and it preys on women and children the most. Rather than holding a school book, children in India are stacking bricks. Rather than sitting in a classroom, young girls in the Philippines are sitting in brothels forced into sexual servitude. In Ghana, young boys are forced into a life of slavery on fishing boats. Over 27 million people around the world today.
It is our hope that the 21st century will be the last century of human trafficking, and that's what we are all committed to.